Imagine finding out your accountant hid $2 billion from you for months.
Oh, wow. That sounds completely terrifying.
Right, like you are sitting at your kitchen table, agonizing over how to pay the electric bill, looking at what to sell or, what to cut.
Yeah,
And the person managing your money knows there is a massive pile of cash sitting right there, but they just don't tell you.
that is exactly the feeling a lot of people are having right now.
Welcome to the deep dive. So, in April 2026, a leaked memo revealed that California's state government actually has roughly $2 billion more than projected for its upcoming budget.
Which is a lot of money to just, suddenly find.
Exactly. But the catch here is that the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's office actually flagged this calculation error back in February.
Like months ago.
Yeah, but Democratic state leaders kept it under wraps. So for months, lawmakers and everyday citizens engaged in these incredibly tense debates over painful cuts to critical services, totally in the dark about these extra funds.
It's just wild to think about.
It is. So the mission of our deep dive today is to unpack the specific $2 billion discrepancy, explore the state's massive historical budget swings, and really understand how billions of taxpayer dollars are actively managed or, well, maybe mismanaged.
And just a quick note before we tear into these numbers. If you look at the stack of source documents we are working from today, the rhetoric is red hot.
Oh, for sure. Extremely heated.
Yeah. We are dealing with highly polarized, politically charged viewpoints from both Republicans and Democrats. So our goal here is not to take a side or endorse any political viewpoint.
Definitely not.
We're just going to peel back the partisan talking points, examine the actual math, and look impartially at the arguments presented so you can understand the mechanics of what is happening under the hood of the nation's largest state economy.
So let's start with the immediate mystery, right?
Yeah.
$2 billion suddenly appearing in a leaked April memo.
Yeah, let's get into the math of that.
The breakdown of this math is fascinating, mostly because of how basic the mistake appears to be. Governor Gavin Newsom's administration made a massive calculation error regarding CalPERS.
For anyone who doesn't know, that is the public employee retirement system.
Right. So they double counted the retirement contribution rates. That single action created a $1.6 billion mistake.
Just from double counting.
Yeah. And then on top of that, they miscalculated future contribution estimates, adding another $450 million to the discrepancy.
Which gets us to that roughly $2 billion mark.
But wait, stop right there. I have to push back on the sheer scale of this. How does a state government with thousands of financial analysts literally double count $1.6 billion without anyone noticing for months?
I know, it sounds absurd on its face.
I mean, we aren't talking about losing a $20 bill in the laundry.
Right. But you have to visualize the mechanics of a state budget. It is not like a single checking account. It is a labyrinth of thousands of different funds, moving parts, and massive projection models. CalPERS manages pensions for over 2 million members.
That's a huge system.
Exactly. So when the Department of Finance plugs contribution rates into their macroeconomic models, a single formula error regarding how local agencies reimburse the state, well, it can cascade across the entire spreadsheet.
So one bad keystroke just multiplies.
Pretty much.
Uh-huh.
A percentage point entered in the wrong column, or a failure to update a baseline assumption for a previous fiscal year multiplies across hundreds of thousands of state employees.
Okay, I guess that makes sense structurally.
The issue isn't necessarily that an error occurred, because, complex financial modeling is prone to human in-system errors. The issue that has sparked outrage is the timeline.
Ah, right, the cover-up, or perceived cover-up.
Right, because the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's office spotted the discrepancy and informed legislative leaders in mid-February.
Which brings us to the two completely different realities being presented in our sources.
Yeah, the framing is totally opposite depending on who you ask.
Totally. The Department of Finance is pushing back aggressively against the word error. A spokesperson essentially brushed it off, characterizing it as a standard revision to better estimate how these payments are made.
A revision. That's a very polite word for $2 billion.
Right. Their argument is that the budget goes through a normal annual revision process in May anyway, so updating the numbers then is just standard operating procedure.
And fiercely opposing that view, you have the Republican minority. Assemblymember David Tangipa called this a deliberate concealment.
Those are strong words. Deliberate concealment.
Extremely strong. The argument here is that the governor's administration intentionally hid this money to obscure the true fiscal picture. Tangipa suggests the motive was to protect funding for the governor's political pet projects and ad campaigns.
So basically keeping it secret so they could spend it how they want?
That is the accusation. If the public knows there is an extra $2 billion, they demand that money be used to save the essential services currently on the chopping block.
Makes sense.
But if you hide the money, you can quietly allocate it during the May revision to the projects you favor, while the public is busy panicking over cuts elsewhere.
It really is like finding a giant stack of cash in your winter coat, but only after you've already suffered through canceling your family's streaming subscriptions and eating ramen for a month.
That is a painful analogy, but yeah, accurate.
And it makes me wonder, at what point does a standard accounting revision morph into a severe transparency issue?
That's the core question.
Because when the public is actively panicking about losing vital services, and you know the data they are arguing over is wrong, holding that information back just creates an incredible deficit of trust.
And that trust deficit is the absolute core of the current political crisis. Transparency in government finance is supposed to allow for informed public debate.
Right, you need facts to debate.
Exactly. When lawmakers are debating whether to cut funding for public schools, healthcare facilities, or transit programs, they are making those decisions based on the projected deficit.
But if the numbers are fake...
Right, if the deficit is artificially inflated by $2 billion because of withheld information, the entire democratic debate is based on a false premise.
And trust is already hanging by a thread because, to put this in perspective, a $2 billion error is essentially a rounding error compared to the state's recent history.
Oh, yeah. The recent history is just wild.
The whiplash Californians have experienced over the last few years is staggering. We need to look at the mirage of 2022.
I think mirage is the perfect word for it.
Right, because just 3 years ago, Governor Newsom stood at a podium and boasted of an unprecedented $97.5 billion budget surplus.
$97.5 billion.
Yeah. He touted it as the largest surplus any state in American history had ever experienced.
And that moment in 2022 is the crucial context for everything happening today. The state was absolutely awash in cash.
Just rolling in it.
But the underlying mechanics of that cash injection were highly fragile. It was driven by two temporary factors. First, massive injections of federal COVID relief funds.
Which obviously weren't going to last forever.
Exactly. And second, and much more importantly, exceptionally high taxable capital gains from wealthy earners during a stock market boom.
Okay, so the state taxes those stock sales heavily.
Very heavily. California has a highly progressive income tax system. A massive portion of the state's general fund comes from the top 1% of earners.
The top 1%. Wow.
Yeah, when the tech sector booms and wealthy individuals sell stock or take their companies public, the state treasury just floods with capital gains taxes.
But the state looked at that temporary spike in revenue and essentially assumed the party would never end.
Which is a classic budgeting mistake.
Because, according to the sources we are reviewing, that sunny projection of a $97.5 billion surplus turned out to be a $165.1 billion revenue projection error over 4 years.
Just an astronomical miss.
I am struggling to even process that number. Missing the mark by $165 billion. That is larger than the entire annual budget of most countries.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it demonstrates the extreme danger of revenue volatility. Analysts use that term to describe an income stream that fluctuates wildly from year to year.
Because it's tied to the stock market.
Exactly. When you rely so heavily on the capital gains of billionaires, your state budget is tied directly to the daily mood of Wall Street.
Right.
When the stock market dips or when tech IPOs dry up, the floor simply falls out from under the state's revenue. Or, if a handful of high net worth individuals decide to move to states with lower tax burdens, hundreds of millions of dollars vanish from the ledger overnight.
So basically, they are building a skyscraper on a fault line.
That is a great way to look at it.
I mean, if a state relies this heavily on the stock market profits of the top 1% to fund basic, predictable services like road maintenance and public schools, the foundation is inherently unstable.
Building a skyscraper on a fault line is the perfect visualization. And the tragedy of that $165 billion miscalculation is that much of that phantom surplus was quickly baked into permanent, ongoing spending programs.
Oh, so they didn't just save the money.
No. Lawmakers assumed the revenue would stay high, so they made long-term financial commitments. Now that the money has vanished, analysts project the state faces persistent structural deficits ranging between $20 billion and $35 billion annually, starting in the 2026-2027 fiscal year.
Every single year. That structural deficit forces us to look at the spending side of the equation, because while the state's income is wildly unpredictable, its spending commitments are incredibly rigid.
Very rigid. Once you start a program, it's hard to stop it.
Exactly. And the sources point to healthcare as a prime example. The state expanded state-paid medical to undocumented immigrants of all ages. California was actually the first state in the nation to do this.
Yeah, it was a landmark policy for them.
But the financial mechanics of that rollout clearly broke down, didn't they?
They did. The intention behind the policy was to provide universal coverage, but the class modeling failed dramatically.
Meaning they underestimated how many people would sign up.
Massively underestimated. The enrollment numbers surged far beyond what the state anticipated. As a result, this specific expansion cost the state $6.2 billion more than initially projected.
$6.2 billion, that's huge.
It is. When you are already facing a massive revenue shortfall, a sudden $6.2 billion cost overrun in a single program creates a localized fiscal crisis.
Right. You just can't absorb that.
No. The strain was so severe that the state was forced into a humiliating retreat, having to freeze new enrollments in the program just to stop the bleeding.
And this is exactly what is fueling the outrage from the Republican minority in our sources. They are demanding a special legislative session to investigate what they view as systemic waste, program abuse, and financial mismanagement.
And they're bringing some very specific numbers to the table to back that up.
They are. The statistics they cite in the sources are sobering. Just recently, investigators uncovered a $270 million healthcare fraud scheme.
$270 million in pure fraud.
Yes, where 21 people were charged with money laundering, identity theft, and fraudulent enrollment in these very state healthcare programs.
The argument being made by critics is that the state is pouring water into a bucket with massive holes in the bottom.
That's a great image for it.
Assembly Republican Minority Leader James Gallagher stated he has no confidence in the Democratic majority's ability to fix this mess without inflicting severe financial pain on everyday Californians.
And he pointed to a few other things too, right?
Yeah, he is pointing to billions of dollars spent on the homelessness crisis over the last decade, with very little visible result on the streets. He also highlights a controversial Capitol Annex construction project estimated to cost taxpayers over $1 billion.
$1 billion for a building project while the budget is underwater.
Exactly. The demand from the critics is clear. Clean up the fraud and halt the massive infrastructure spending before asking taxpayers to endure cuts to their essential services.
But the political dynamics here are shifting in real time. In the wake of these staggering deficits and the public fallout from the leaked $2 billion memo, we are seeing a dramatic pivot in messaging from Democratic leaders.
It's a complete 180.
It really is. The tone has completely changed from the era of the $97.5 billion surplus. Now they are actively urging strict fiscal restraint.
You are seeing a sudden embrace of austerity. Assembly Budget Committee Chair Jesse Gabriel and Senate President Pro Tempore Mike McGuire are publicly emphasizing that the state needs to buckle down.
Which is not something you usually hear from them.
Not at all. They are halting program expansions and shifting their entire focus to stabilizing the budget to protect core programs for working families. Even Assembly Speaker Robert Rivas explicitly stated that this is, quote, not a moment for expanding programs.
When the leadership of the majority party changes their tune that drastically, you know the internal math is terrifying them.
It is the painful hangover of the boom and bust budgeting cycle.
Boom and bust.
Think of it like a household budget. Imagine you get an unexpected, massive end-of-year bonus at work.
Okay, I'd love that.
Right. A prudent move might be to put that money into savings or use it to pay off a one-time debt like a credit card. But instead, you use that bonus to qualify for a much larger mortgage on a new house.
Oh, no, because the bonus doesn't happen next year.
Exactly. The bonus was temporary, but the new mortgage payment is permanent. That is exactly what the state did. They took temporary capital gains windfalls and used them to create permanent social programs.
And when the temporary money dries up, those permanent programs still demand funding.
Right. And cutting an existing program, taking a service away from a citizen who now relies on it, is politically toxic. So the state is left scrambling, using accounting tricks, draining emergency reserves, or making draconian cuts to other vital areas just to keep the lights on.
And as if a self-inflicted structural deficit wasn't enough, we have to talk about the wild cards. California is facing massive external threats to its budget that lawmakers have absolutely zero control over.
The fragility of the budget makes the state incredibly vulnerable to external shocks. And natural disasters are the most immediate threat.
Like the wildfires.
Right. When a devastating Southern California wildfire sweeps through a region, it creates a catastrophic double hit to the state's finances.
Because it obliterates the local tax base while simultaneously demanding massive state spending.
Exactly.
If a town burns down, businesses are closed, homes are destroyed, and local property and sales tax revenues just vanish.
They're just gone.
But at that exact same moment, the state has to mobilize emergency services, deploy the National Guard, and pour hundreds of millions of dollars into relief and rebuilding efforts. You are losing your income at the exact second your expenses skyrocket.
And beyond natural disasters, the state is bracing for a potential showdown with the federal government. Under the Trump administration, California faces potential shifts or drastic cuts in federal funding.
Which is another massive variable.
Huge. The state relies on billions of federal dollars to subsidize its education, healthcare, and welfare programs. If Washington decides to tighten the purse strings or alter the funding formulas, California will face a brutal choice.
Allow those critical programs to shrink or divert even more state taxpayer dollars to fill the gaping hole left by the federal government.
Which is money they clearly do not have.
Which brings us to a fascinating piece of proposed legislation highlighted in our sources. It perfectly illustrates how lawmakers can make sweeping, emotionally driven commitments without fully exploring the long-term financial and legal consequences.
Yeah, this is a really interesting case study.
We need to unpack Assembly Bill 2356.
So this legislation proposes transferring Tolowa State Park to the Tolowa Nation, a local Native American tribe. We're talking about 4,301 acres of prime coastal land in Del Norte County.
That's a massive piece of land.
It is. And the tribe's argument is deeply rooted in history. They argue that this is their ancestral land, stolen through historical mistreatment and state-sponsored depredations against Native Americans.
Right.
From their perspective, and the perspective of the bill's sponsors, transferring the deed is a long overdue act of respect, healing, and reparation.
And the legislation does include specific language stating that the land would be maintained as open space. It includes assurances that the land won't be developed commercially, so, no building massive casino resorts on the coastline.
But critics in the sources bring up a massive legal hurdle.
Yeah, the enforcement issue.
Right. Once you transfer the deed and that land becomes sovereign tribal territory, enforcing those state assurances is virtually impossible.
Because you cannot easily dictate zoning laws to a sovereign nation.
Exactly. That is the legal friction. But the far bigger issue that critics are raising isn't really about this specific park or this specific tribe. It's about the sheer scale of the precedent being set. This is where policy collides with the state's asset ledger.
Right, because if this proposed land transfer is granted as a form of historical reparation, how does the state legally or logically refuse future demands from other tribes?
That's the million or really billion-dollar question.
California currently manages 280 state parks, covering 1.6 million acres of land. Virtually every square inch of California was once home to various Native American tribes.
Sure.
If the state concedes that historical mistreatment necessitates returning a 4,000-acre state park, how do you say no to the tribe demanding the land under Yosemite or the beaches of Malibu or the other 279 state parks?
It creates an uncontainable legal and philosophical precedent. Lawmakers are trying to right a historical wrong, which is a powerful moral imperative.
Absolutely.
But by doing so, through the transfer of state-owned public assets, they open the door to immense potential consequences for the public's access to unique parklands and the state's overall net worth.
It's a huge domino effect.
If 1.6 million acres of state parks suddenly become vulnerable to transfer claims, the state could lose control of some of its most valuable natural and economic resources. It is a prime example of a localized policy decision carrying long-term systemic implications that stretch far beyond the immediate news cycle.
So, bringing this all back to you, the listener, why should you care about the internal plumbing of California's budget, especially if you don't even live in the state?
That's a fair question.
Because what is happening here is a masterclass in why the mechanics of local government finance fundamentally shape your daily life. It doesn't matter if you're in California, Texas, or Ohio.
The math rules apply everywhere.
Right. When a government relies on highly unpredictable income, like the stock market gains of a few wealthy individuals, to pay for very predictable essential services like healthcare, infrastructure, and schools, the math always catches up.
Always. And when the math catches up, everyday taxpayers are the ones who absorb the impact.
They're the ones left holding the bag.
Yeah. Whether it is a $2 billion accounting discrepancy kept quiet in a back room, $165 billion projection error fueled by temporary stock market exuberance, or well-intentioned policy expansions that ignore financial realities. The structural integrity of a state's budget directly dictates the stability of the services you rely on.
It all circles back to that initial feeling we talked about. Sitting at the table, stressing over the electric bill, only to find out the people managing the books have been operating in a completely different reality.
It's frustrating.
It really is. And it leaves you with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over. If a state's financial health is entirely dependent on the daily whims of the stock market and the capital gains of billionaires, are everyday taxpayers essentially forced to be high-stakes day traders without ever downloading a brokerage app?